Is history an art or a science? This question at first glance doesn't really seem that tough. It should, in theory, be an art, right? It's a humanity. When you graduate from a college with a degree in history, you graduate with a Bachelor of Arts. But once you delve deeper into the question, it actually becomes a lot more tougher than you would expect. There are good arguments to make that history is something of a science. For example, I'm going to start with a very famous quote by Leopold von Ranke. Quote, "History is a science of collecting, finding, penetrating. It is an art because it recreates and portrays that which it has found and recognized." Upon hearing this, you would probably rationally assume that, well, then history is a science, given this quote, which, at first glance, it is. But let me ask you, is history an art, or is it a science? You probably don't have a good answer, and even if you say, oh, it's an art, or oh, it's a science, you probably said that in your head and looked back at yourself and thought, well, is it? To many a historian, this argument is fierce. There is plenty of reading that I will leave in the description debating this exact topic. Those philosophical historians declare that history is an art, while those practicing historians believe it to be a science, and in a sense, they're both correct. At its core, this question is something of a logical fallacy, since history does not simply need to be a 0 or a 1, an art or a science. Quote, "A good philosophy of history is one in which the historian has examined the presupposition of the task and has rationally examined the goals and purposes of the task of doing history." To put that simply and quickly, it's subjective. So then, what are the arguments? I think one of the hallmark reasons that history classifies as an art rather than a science is the fact that it often reads like a story. When a good teacher teaches history, it is like watching someone create something. You watch them as they brilliantly connect seemingly disconnected things together to create a literary tale that scratches the itch for knowledge. Like, let me ask you, how often have you had a history lesson that was objectively boring? Probably a lot of you. I'd be willing to bet most of you. I sure as hell have, and I love history. But why was it boring? Was it because the content wasn't interesting? Sometimes, sure, that has been the case for me, for sure. But I'd be willing to bet 7 times out of 10, it's because your teacher taught it like a scientist. They didn't teach it like a story, they taught it like a science. To me, this is a core tenet of history as an art, being able to captivate a previously uninformed and often uninterested audience. Making that audience informed and then creating a new desire to learn in and of itself is an art. One could argue this is merely the act of performance, to which that is correct to an extent. The difference between them, though, is one must build upon the science of history to create the art of the human expression of history. In addition to this, history can be used to frame current events and used to theorize what may happen given a specific scenario. We do this often in geopolitics, where people theorize what might happen given historical context. This is where I think the strongest argument exists for history as an art rather than a science. When we review a current crisis through the lens of an old one, what are we doing if not creating a form of art? We are forming a new thesis of humanity through the knowledge of what our ancestors knew. It could also be argued that this is a science. After all, what is replication if not one of the hallmark ideas of science? The difference, though, at least in my mind, is that replication in the historical sense is far looser of an idea. One could compare the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014 to that of the German occupation of the Sudetenland with a very strong argument. However, these two things are not exactly the same, so it is not as scientific of a replication as the term would have you believe, but it is a strong artistic replication. Despite all this, the research of history is a fundamental science. Data collection, analyzation of that data, and forming hypotheses are all scientific endeavors. There's a wonderful editorial in the European Review, which I will link in the description, and I'll put something up here. It gives a lot of wonderful insights into how we view history as a concept and that relation between art and science. It does objectively make sense to be able to split history into different subdivisions depending on the ratio of art to science. After all, art history is going to have far more art involved than something like technological history, which is going to have far more science involved. Even though this is somewhat of a good solution to the problem of solving a logical fallacy, it's still not a great explanation. It's really only attempting to rephrase the question under a new set parameter. And while that is good for trying to give us an answer to the question, the real answer to this question is that it can be whatever it is in that bio. Anyone who has spent serious time writing a paper understands the sheer amount of reading and critical thinking it takes. Learning is hard. Coming up with an idea to teach, harder. Teaching itself, hardest. So therefore, it is no wonder that so many people consider history to be vaguely a science. During the Cold War, as American geopolitical interests pushed harder and harder for STEM majors, college as a whole began to lower its interest in the humanities. With this, historians were in panic as to how to keep their field alive. As the humanities struggled over the decades, the only way to find worth in it was to adjust to the trends of the time. If STEM was more important than ever before, then history would have to attempt to adjust and become a science. If you'd like more evidence of this, look at the numbers. The amount of graduates with degrees in history dropped by 11,000 in the past 10 years, while engineering and comp sci alone have increased by over 100,000. College enrollment has been slightly down since 2010, peaking at 18.1 million and settling at about 15.9 million in 2024. Despite this cannot be fully accounted for the demographic shift, which indicated a shifting cultural significance on the STEM fields. So then, given this, it is fair to say that history has had an artificial shift to be more scientific to keep up with the demands of society. This inherently makes sense. The historians of the older age are at least portrayed to be far more romantic in their literature than modern historians. In addition to the push for more STEM, Americans have come to view the humanities as a poor career path, but uniquely not history. Here's where we get a little bit into the weeds of subjectivity. Why did history manage to stay so far ahead of the others in terms of its popularity? Is it because it's a better field? Well, no. So how come history managed to stay above the others? And to this, I don't have a great answer. I can speak from the heart, though, and give you some ideas as to what I think. I think that some proportion of the reason that history has stayed above the others is it is a prestigious institution. This idea of researching history carries a lot more prestige than something like fashion or anything within the humanities of that realm. That isn't to say that those things are not useful. Everything is useful in its own way. I just think that history does have more prestige to it, and I also think that a lot of the reason that history maybe has lost some of its credibility in recent decades is simply the fact that it isn't seen as particularly useful to productivity, right? Comp sci, engineering, mathematics, these things are hard sciences which produce traceable, understood economic advancement for the country. But history is a social study. It's a humanity. It's different. It doesn't produce as trackable GDP impact on the American economy. It impacts our culture, and culture is a lot harder to quantify. And I think that's one of the reasons that the humanities suffer so much in terms of their perception relative to some of the STEM fields. There's also a good argument to be made that history has managed to somewhat rebrand itself as more of a soft science. It was something in the realm of psychology, sociology, even something like economics, which is considered to be an auxiliary science, according to a lot of the things that I read. So there could be a lot of an argument there that a lot of the reason it actually managed to so simply brave the storm is because it managed to rebrand itself somewhat effectively. At the end of the day, this question is a logical fallacy. It doesn't really have an answer. It doesn't have a false answer. It doesn't have a true answer. And frankly, it doesn't really matter. It's a fun thought exercise, and it's good to judge how you as a historian will act. To me, the only way this argument actually holds any weight is asking yourself, what kind of historian are you? Are you an artistically inclined historian or a scientific historian? Do you synthesize new information with possibility, or do you only go off of what you know? Is either one correct? No. Is either one wrong? No. Both are used to improve the field of history every single day.